Chapter 4. How to get past Mrs. Thrall. That was Tessa's dilemma. She imagined herself picking locks or climbing ropes strung between her window and the window next door. But every scenario she could dream up seemed like it would end the same way, in a confrontation with Mrs. Thrall rather than getting at the rescue. Tessa lay awake far into the night, trying to come up with a workable plan. Long after the thumping and tapping stopped, it occurred to her that she could have studied the Morse code symbols a little longer and come up with a coded reply. What do you need? Maybe. Or how can I help? She tapped the wall once, experimentally, but there was no response. She got out the M encyclopedia again and stared at the Morse code key. She thought about writing out a message she could tap and thump in the morning, but each letter was so complicated. Even if she managed to make Gideon understand her, what would she do if he started desperately tapping and thumping out a lengthy answer? She'd never be able to follow it, and he'd probably be caught. No, there had to be some other way. She fell asleep, and though she wasn't aware of any dreams, she woke up in the morning thinking about flowers. He's a hero, surely. Surely Mrs. Thrall wouldn't be surprised to see some delivery person bringing flowers from an admirer. Surely he's gotten lots of flowers before. It was worth a try. Tessa herself couldn't afford to buy any flowers. They were a luxury, rarely grown because they were a distraction from the war effort. But she'd seen goldenrod and milkweed growing in the dirt piles behind the apartment, the same spot where she and Gideon had, maybe, once made mud pies. If Tessa picked some of the weeds and wrapped them in paper so only a leaf or two showed, well, wasn't there at least a chance it would fool Mrs. Thrall? Tessa crept out into the chilly morning air. It was Saturday, but weekend workers streamed down the sidewalk, headed for their jobs. All the faces she saw were gray and worn and weary, as if the people had long ago given up any hope of a better life. Oh, please, Gideon, Tessa thought. That's why we needed a hero. She darted around the building, stepping from one clump of ugly, spiky grass to another. Dew clung to a spiderweb, binding several of the taller weeds together, and Tessa wished she could carry that up to Gideon, too. It's so beautiful. Wouldn't he see the beauty in it? Tessa wondered. The kids at school never saw things the way Tessa has. Why did she think that Gideon might? And anyhow, she wasn't supposed to be finding anything beautiful. She just needed to trick Mrs. Thrall. Tessa hacked at the plants before her. Then she had a big enough bundle to make a convincing bouquet. She went back upstairs to her apartment and wrapped the whole thing in paper. And then, before she lost her nerve, she knocked on the Thrall's door. Florist delivery, Tessa called out. The door creaked open. Mrs. Thrall stood before her in a deep purple robe, and for a moment Tessa lost herself staring. The robe was new. Where could you buy new things anymore? Yes, Mrs. Thrall said. Tessa forced herself to stop staring at the robe. She lifted her gaze to Mrs. Thrall's face. These are flowers to be delivered to Lieutenant Pilot Gideon Thrall, Tessa said. She started to hold them out to Mrs. Thrall, then caught herself. She clutched the bundle of weeds tighter to her chest. I have orders to deliver them directly into his hands, she added. Mrs. Thrall frowned. The lines around her eyes were etched much deeper than Tessa would have expected. But Tessa had only ever seen her from afar. It wasn't surprising that Mrs. Thrall looked different up close. Your orders are to see him face to face, then, Mrs. Thrall said in a mocking voice. Tessa's heart sank. She sees right through me, Tessa thought. She knows I'm lying. But Mrs. Thrall didn't slam the door in her face. For a moment, she just stood there silently, watching Tessa. Tessa was sure Mrs. Thrall was noticing Tessa's ratty sweater, her threadbare jeans, the way her dark hair curled in all the wrong directions. Tessa remembered how, even before Gideon went off to the academy. How old was he then? 8, 10? Mrs. Thrall always looked so disapprovingly at girls around the neighborhood who so much as glanced at Gideon. She had narrowed eyes. She had a narrowed eyes glance that all but spoke, "Oh no, you're not good enough for my son." She did this even to pretty girls, girls whose families had money, or at least as much money as anyone had in Waterford City. Tessa wasn't all that pretty, and her family had much less money than anyone else they knew. And yet suddenly Mrs. Thrall took a step back. Come in, she said. I can? Tessa asked incredulously. I mean, thank you. She stepped into the Thrall's apartment, and Mrs. Thrall closed the door behind her. Immediately something changed to Mrs. Thrall's expression, as if she'd put on a mask. Or taken one off. Gideon's room is over there, Mrs. Thrall said, pointing. Her face sagged, as if keeping up appearances was beyond her now. She didn't look like the haughty mother of a hero anymore. She just looked old and weary and despairing. Tessa realized she'd been thinking about everything wrong. Mrs. Thrall wasn't the enemy. She wasn't the obstacle Tessa needed to worry about. But what was Gideon's problem? Is he... Tessa began. Just go in there, Mrs. Thrall commanded. You can see for yourself. Mrs. Thrall turned her head away. but not before Tessa saw tears sparkling in the woman's eyes. There was a remnant of her old glare in her expression. You're not good enough. No one's worthy of my Gideon. In a flash, Tessa understood something she didn't want to understand, something ugly. Mrs. Thrall did think Tessa was one of those girls who threw themselves at boys. She hated Tessa, but she was willing to let Tessa in to see Gideon anyhow because Tessa's understanding faltered. I'm not like that, she said, defending herself. The disgust in Mrs. Thrall's expression took over. You brought him flowers, didn't you? She sneered. She might as well have said, you brought him weeds. You're a weed yourself. Trash. Tessa stood up straight. She wanted so badly to say, he asked me to come. He asked for me. But it wasn't quite true. Gideon couldn't have known that Tessa lay on the other side of his wall last night. He didn't even know her. Even if they had played a little together as kids, even if that mud pie picture of them together were real, not something Tessa's mother had faked, then Gideon probably didn't remember it any better than Tessa did. He certainly hadn't recognized Tessa back at the auditorium. But he was trying to signal someone last night, Tessa thought. Who? Why? She looked at the door into Gideon's room, which was closed tight. The door was dark and scarred, as if someone had attacked it with a knife. Lots of doors in the apartment building looked like that, but the scars made Tessa hesitate. She remembered the flat, expressionless tone in Gideon's voice when he told her, all I did was kill people. She shivered. He wouldn't, she began. Was she going to say hurt me? Kill me? About Gideon Thrall? The biggest hero in Waterford City history? Mrs. Thrall recoiled. He doesn't even get out of bed, she snarled. Mrs. Thrall reached past Tessa to twist the doorknob and push the door open, and then she shoved Tessa forward and shut the door behind her, trapping Tessa in Gideon's room.